The transformation nobody wanted, but everyone got. The aftermath of the 2026 collapse didn't look like the dramatic revolution that dystopian fiction promised. There were no roving gangs in the streets, no complete societal breakdown, no return to medieval barbarism. What emerged instead was something more subtle and more permanent, a fundamental restructuring of how a human civilization organized itself. The world that exists now, in the wake of the collapse, is not the world that existed before, not because everything was destroyed, but because the systems that held the old world together proved incapable of surviving contact with reality. And when those systems failed, the world was forced to become something else. Not by choice, by necessity. Understanding what the world became requires understanding what actually broke, why it couldn't be fixed, and what replaced it. This isn't a story about what we lost. This is a story about what we were forced to build in the ruins. What actually collapsed. The 2026 collapse wasn't a single event. It was a cascade. Multiple systems failing simultaneously, each failure accelerating the others, creating a polycrisis that overwhelmed every attempt at containment. The credit markets froze first. This was the visible crisis, the one that made headlines. Corporate bonds became untradeable. Leveraged loans defaulted in waves. The commercial paper market, which had funded short-term corporate operations for decades, simply stopped functioning. Companies that were profitable on paper couldn't make payroll because they couldn't roll over debt. But credit market failure was just the trigger. The second system to break was collateral. The vast network of pledged assets that underpinned modern finance disintegrated when asset values became impossible to determine. Repo markets seized, margin calls cascaded. Rehypothecation chains snapped. The lubricant of modern finance turned to concrete. The third system to break was supply chains. Not from lack of goods, but from lack of trust. International shipping requires letters of credit. Those require functioning banks. When banks couldn't assess counterparty risk, they stopped issuing letters of credit. Ships sat in ports, full of cargo that couldn't be delivered because paperwork couldn't be processed. The fourth system was monetary coordination. Central banks had maintained relative stability through informal coordination for decades. The 2026 crisis shattered that cooperation. Currency wars erupted, competitive devaluations, capital controls. Nations hoarded reserves and weaponized their currencies. The global financial architecture fragmented into hostile camps. The fifth system was energy markets. Oil contracts require futures markets for price discovery and hedging. When derivatives markets broke, energy companies couldn't hedge production. Utilities couldn't lock in prices. The result was extreme volatility that made planning impossible. Energy investment collapsed, not from lack of demand, but from inability to manage risk. The sixth system was food distribution. Modern agriculture operates on extended credit cycles. Farmers borrow for seeds and fertilizer in spring, repay after harvest. When credit disappeared, planting seasons were missed. The food system didn't collapse immediately, but a silent timer started counting down to harvest failures that would arrive months later. Each of these failures fed the others. Credit problems created collateral problems. Collateral problems froze derivatives. Frozen derivatives killed hedging. Dead hedging stopped investment. Failed investment meant shortages. Shortages meant inflation. Inflation destroyed more credit. The doom loops interlocked. The speed of collapse exceeded response capability. In previous crises, policymakers had days or weeks to respond. In 2026, they had hours. By the time emergency meetings convened, situations had already evolved beyond the measures being discussed. By the time legislation was drafted, the crisis it addressed had morphed into something else. Why nothing could be fixed? The initial assumption was that the collapse could be fixed using the tools that had worked in 2008 and 2020. Massive liquidity injection, emergency lending facilities, government guarantees, coordinated central bank action. These tools had worked before. Surely they would work again. They didn't. Not because policymakers didn't try, but because the nature of the crisis was different. In 2008, the problem was illiquidity masquerading as insolvency. Banks had assets that were temporarily hard to value. The Fed provided liquidity, bought time, and eventually the assets stabilized. The system was fundamentally sound. It just needed support during panic. In 2026, the problem was actual insolvency hiding behind complexity. The assets weren't temporarily illiquid, they were permanently impaired. Decades of low interest rates had inflated asset values to levels that couldn't be sustained. When rates rose and economic reality reasserted itself, the impairment became undeniable. You can't solve insolvency with liquidity. You can delay recognition, you can extend and pretend, but eventually reality wins. The Fed learned this the hard way when their emergency lending facilities were met with shrugs. Providing cheap liquidity to insolvent institutions just gave them cheap funding for their insolvency. Government guarantees faced a credibility problem. The US government had $35 trillion in debt and growing. Could they credibly guarantee the entire financial system, which had hundreds of trillions in notional exposure? Market participants did the math and concluded no. Government guarantees were priced as worthless. Fiscal stimulus confronted political gridlock. In 2008, there was bipartisan recognition that action was needed. In 2020, pandemic crisis created unity. In 2026, there was neither. Congress was paralyzed. Every stimulus proposal became a political weapon. By the time anything passed, it was too little, too late, and too politically compromised to be effective. International coordination fractured along geopolitical lines. The world of 2026 was not the cooperative post-Cold War environment of 2008. It was a world of great power competition. The US and China were economic adversaries. Europe was fragmenting. Russia was isolated. Coordinated action required trust that didn't exist. Central bank swap lines, which had provided dollar liquidity globally in past crises, became geopolitical bargaining chips. The Fed wouldn't provide unlimited swaps to China. The ECB wouldn't support Russian banks. The Bank of Japan faced political pressure to prioritize domestic needs. Every central bank action had to pass a political filter. Russian banks. The Bank of Japan faced political pressure to prioritize domestic needs. Every central bank action had to pass a political filter. The technical capacity to respond was also compromised. Many central banks had shrunk their balance sheets through quantitative tightening. They had less ammunition. Interest rates, while higher than the zero bound, weren't high enough to provide much cutting room. The toolbox was smaller than in previous crises. But the deepest reason nothing could be fixed was that the problems were structural, not cyclical. The pre-2026 economy was built on assumptions that proved false. Assumptions about perpetual growth, about manageable debt levels, about stable geopolitics, about infinite resources, about climate stability. When those assumptions broke, the economy built on them couldn't be repaired. It had to be replaced. The first forced transformation? Localization. The collapse of global supply chains and international financial coordination forced the first major transformation, a shift from globalization to localization. Not by choice, not from ideology, from necessity. When international shipping became unreliable and letters of credit stopped functioning, companies that depended on global supply chains faced an existential crisis. They couldn't get components. They couldn't deliver products. They couldn't survive. The companies that survived were those that could localize quickly. Manufacturing returned home, not because of tariffs or trade wars, but because distance became a critical vulnerability. A factory 5,000 miles away in a country with currency controls and banking problems was useless. A factory 50 miles away was invaluable. This shift happened faster than anyone thought possible. Factories that took years to plan in the old world were built in months in the new world. Regulations that had constrained development were waived under emergency authorities. Zoning laws were suspended. Environmental reviews were accelerated. NIMBYism collapsed when the alternative was empty shelves. The industrial landscape transformed. Massive factories optimized for global-scale production became obsolete. They were replaced by smaller, more flexible facilities serving regional markets. 3D printing and advanced manufacturing techniques that had been marginal before became essential because they enabled local production of previously imported goods. Agriculture underwent similar localization. The pre-collapse food system was hyper-specialized. California grew lettuce for the entire country. Iowa grew corn for the world. This efficiency was fragile. When transportation costs spiked and fuel supplies became uncertain, shipping lettuce 3,000 miles stopped making sense. Local food production exploded. Urban agriculture went from boutique hobby to critical infrastructure. Rooftop gardens, vertical farms, converted parking lots. Every city became partially self-sufficient in fresh produce because they had no choice. The transition was chaotic and inefficient, but it was better than starvation. Energy localization followed the same pattern. The pre-collapse grid was vast and interconnected. Power generated in one region flowed hundreds of miles to consumption centers. This system was efficient but vulnerable. Grid failures cascaded across regions. Cyber attacks had continental impacts. Post-collapse, energy systems fragmented into microgrids. Cities, towns, even large buildings developed independent generation capacity. Solar, wind, small-scale natural gas, whatever worked locally. The loss of efficiency was offset by increased resilience. When one microgrid failed, others kept functioning. Water systems localized. Telecommunications localized. Healthcare localized. Every system that had been optimized for global or national scale was rebuilt for regional scale. The world didn't deglobalize ideologically. It deglobalized practically, one broken supply chain at a time. The economic implications were profound. Productivity declined. The efficiency gains from specialization and scale were lost. Goods became more expensive. Selection decreased. Living standards fell. But the system was more stable, more resilient, less vulnerable to distant shocks. Trade didn't disappear. Regional trading blocs emerged. But they were smaller, more politically aligned, and based on bilateral relationships rather than multilateral frameworks. The WTO became irrelevant. Free trade agreements weren't renewed. Each region built walls around itself and traded cautiously with neighbors. The second forced transformation, digital physical divergence. The collapse of traditional finance created an unexpected transformation in how value was stored and transferred. The digital and physical economies diverged into parallel systems. When banks became unreliable, people needed alternatives. In some communities, barter re-emerged, but barter doesn't scale. You can trade eggs for bread with your neighbor. You can't run an economy on it. Something else was needed. Cryptocurrencies surged into the vacuum. Not Bitcoin specifically, though it participated, but a proliferation of local and regional digital currencies. Cities issued their own, corporations created script for employees. Community groups developed exchange tokens. The monetary system fragmented into thousands of competing alternatives. Governments tried to stop this, they failed. When the official currency is unreliable and banks are closed, people use what works. Attempting to ban cryptocurrency when your own monetary system is collapsing is futile. The underground economy simply swallows more economic activity. But cryptocurrency had limitations. It required electricity, internet, and digital literacy. In rural areas without reliable power, it didn't work. For elderly populations without smartphones, it was inaccessible. The digital divide became an economic divide. Physical currency persisted, but it evolved. Gold and silver re-emerged, not as official money, but as store of value. Small denomination gold became common for significant transactions. Silver coins circulated for daily purchases. The pre-collapse financial system had mostly demonetized precious metals. The collapse remonetized them. Other physical stores of value emerged. Ammunition became a quasi-currency in some regions. Cigarettes, alcohol, and coffee served as medium of exchange where they were scarce. Fuel coupons became tradable. Any portable good with stable demand developed currency-like properties. The result was a bifurcated economy. A digital economy running on various cryptocurrencies and blockchain-based systems, and a physical economy running on precious metals, barter, and commodity money. Most transactions happened in one system or the other, rarely crossing between them. This created arbitrage opportunities and new business models. Intermediaries who could bridge digital and physical systems became essential. They'd accept cryptocurrency and provide physical goods, or vice versa. These intermediaries charged substantial fees, but they were the only way to move value between systems. Banking didn't disappear, but it transformed. The massive universal banks that dominated the pre-collapse era mostly failed or were nationalized. What emerged were smaller, specialized institutions. Some banks dealt only in digital assets. Others focused on precious metals. Few tried to do both. Lending collapsed and stayed collapsed. Banks that survived did so by holding reserves and providing payment services, not by extending credit. The fractional reserve banking system that had existed for centuries effectively ended. Banks became warehouses for wealth, not creators of credit. This destroyed the money multiplier effect. In the old system, $1 of reserves could support $10 of lending. In the new system, $1 of deposits meant $1 of reserves. The money supply contracted dramatically. This was deflationary, but it was also stable. No bank runs, no credit bubbles, no overlevered institutions. The velocity of money, which measures how quickly money circulates, collapsed. People hoarded what they had because they didn't trust the system. This further depressed economic activity, but it also meant the economic activity that did occur was based on real savings, not credit creation. The third forced transformation, community-scale governance. The collapse of effective national governance forced decision-making downward to community level. Again, not by ideological preference, but by practical necessity. National governments didn't disappear. They still existed, still issued proclamations, still held elections, but their capacity to actually govern declined dramatically. They couldn't collect taxes effectively when the economy was informal. They couldn't enforce regulations when they couldn't pay inspectors. They couldn't provide services when they had no revenue. This created a vacuum, and vacuums get filled. At the local level, informal governance structures emerged. Neighborhood associations, community councils, business improvement districts, religious organizations. These groups took over functions that governments could no longer perform. Security is the most obvious example. When police departments couldn't patrol effectively due to budget cuts and fuel shortages, communities organized their own security. Neighborhood watch programs evolved into neighborhood patrol programs. Private security became community security. This wasn't without problems. Some communities developed authoritarian structures. Strongman leadership emerged when people craved order more than freedom. Other communities descended into violence as rival factions fought for control. But many communities developed surprisingly functional self-governance. The successful communities shared common features. They had strong social capital before the collapse, networks of trust that could be activated quickly. They had diverse skill sets within the community, not everyone dependent on the same industry. They had leaders who were competent rather than just charismatic. Infrastructure maintenance shifted to community level. Roads that governments couldn't maintain were adopted by neighborhoods. Community work days to fill potholes and clear drains. Utilities that couldn't afford professional staff trained volunteers. The quality was inconsistent, but something was better than nothing. Education transformed dramatically. Public schools depended on state funding that disappeared, closed, or became shells. Communities organized alternatives. Co-ops where parents taught. Apprenticeship systems where skills were passed down directly. Libraries became learning centers, staffed by volunteers. The quality of education declined on average, but became more practical. Less abstract knowledge, more applicable skills. Children learned trades, agriculture, maintenance, the things needed for survival. The pre-collapse emphasis on college preparation became irrelevant when colleges mostly closed. Healthcare localized in similar ways. Hospitals were too expensive to maintain. They closed or scaled back to emergency only. Primary care shifted to clinics run by nurses and paramedics. Communities without medical professionals trained their own. The care was basic, but it existed. Preventive care became essential because treatment was scarce. Communities organized exercise groups, nutrition education, mental health support circles. Not from wellness consciousness, but from necessity. Keeping people healthy was cheaper than treating them after they got sick. Justice systems fragmented. Without functional courts and prisons, communities developed alternatives. Restorative justice circles, community service requirements, banishment for serious offenders. The systems were rough, sometimes unfair, but they provided some mechanism for maintaining order. Taxation evolved into contribution systems. Communities couldn't enforce tax collection, so they relied on voluntary contribution and social pressure. Those who didn't contribute were excluded from benefits. Free riding was punished not by law, but by social ostracism. This created strong incentives for cooperation within communities, but also created strong boundaries between communities. Your community took care of you, other communities were other. The cosmopolitan ideal of universal human fellowship gave way to practical tribalism. The fourth forced transformation, labor, and purpose. The collapse of the formal economy destroyed the employment system that had defined modern life. The transformation in how people worked and found purpose was perhaps the most personally disruptive change. The pre-collapse economy was built on specialization. People spent years training for narrow skills. They worked for organizations in specific roles. They derived income and identity from their jobs. This system was efficient but fragile. When the formal economy collapsed, specialized skills often became useless. Marketing professionals, financial analysts, middle managers, human resources specialists, these roles disappeared because the organizations that employed them disappeared. Millions of people found themselves with skills the new world didn't need. The initial response was confusion and despair. People whose entire identity was built around their career suddenly had no career. The psychological impact was devastating. Depression rates spiked, substance abuse soared, suicide became a leading cause of death for displaced professionals. But human beings are adaptable. Gradually, people found new roles. The marketing professional learned to garden. The financial analyst learned carpentry. The middle manager learned to repair engines. The transformation was painful, but it happened. The new economy valued different skills. Practical physical skills became premium. Knowing how to fix things, how to grow things, how to build things. These skills, which had been devalued in the pre-collapse knowledge economy, suddenly commanded respect and value. Social skills remained valuable, but in different ways. The ability to mediate disputes became essential in community governance. The ability to teach became critical as formal education collapsed. The ability to organize became necessary for coordinating community efforts. The work week transformed. The pre-collapse 40-hour week in a single job became rare. Most people worked multiple roles. A few hours teaching children, a few hours growing food, a few hours maintaining infrastructure, a few hours providing security. Work became diverse and community-focused. This eliminated unemployment in the traditional sense. Everyone who was able contributed something, but it also meant nobody was employed in the old sense. There were no formal jobs, no regular paychecks, no employer benefits. People worked and were compensated through community contribution systems. Retirement disappeared as a concept. The idea that you could stop working at 65 and live on savings or government benefits became laughable when savings were worthless and governments were broke. People worked as long as they were able, in whatever capacity they could. But this didn't mean elderly people were abandoned. Communities found roles for everyone. Older people couldn't do heavy physical labor, but they could teach, mentor, mediate, provide childcare, preserve food, maintain traditions. Every age had value. Purpose shifted from career achievement to community contribution. Pre-collapse, people found meaning in job titles and professional accomplishments. Post-collapse, meaning came from being useful, from helping your community survive, from passing on skills, from maintaining civilization. This was psychologically healthier for some, devastating for others. People who had defined themselves by external success struggled. People who had always wanted to do meaningful work but felt trapped in corporate bullshit jobs found liberation. The collapse sorted people into those who could adapt and those who couldn't. The fifth forced transformation. Knowledge and technology. The collapse created a paradox regarding technology and knowledge. In some ways, technological capacity declined dramatically. In other ways, technology became more important than ever. The internet survived, barely. The physical infrastructure mostly remained intact, but maintaining it became problematic. Repairs required parts that were no longer manufactured. Power supplies became unreliable. Undersea cables needed maintenance that couldn't be performed. The internet fragmented into regional networks. Connection between regions became sporadic. The World Wide Web became a collection of regional webs, sometimes connected, often isolated. Global communication continued, but it became unreliable and slow. This fragmentation had cultural implications. The shared global information space that had existed before the collapse shattered. Different regions developed different narratives about what had happened and why. Without shared media, communities drifted into separate information ecosystems. Cloud computing mostly collapsed. Centralized data centers were too expensive to maintain. Companies and communities that had stored everything in the cloud found themselves cut off from their data. The cloud evaporated, the data stored there was often lost forever. This forced a return to local data storage. Physical hard drives, local servers, redundant backups. The efficiency of cloud computing was replaced by the resilience of distributed storage. Data access became slower and more cumbersome, but it was under local control. Software development continued, but changed character. The pre-collapse software industry had relied on global teams and cloud infrastructure. Post-collapse, development became local and practical. Communities needed software to manage distribution systems, coordinate work, track resources. The software developed was functional rather than elegant. Open source became dominant not from ideology, but necessity. Proprietary software required vendor support that often didn't exist. Open source could be maintained locally. Communities employed programmers to modify and maintain the open source tools they depended on. Manufacturing technology simplified. The complex global supply chains required for advanced semiconductor production broke down. Cutting-edge chip manufacturing stopped. Communities used older, simpler technology that could be maintained locally. This created a technology regression in some areas. The most advanced chips available in the New World were equivalent to technology from 10-15 years earlier. But these chips were enough for most applications, and they could be manufactured and repaired locally. Other technologies advanced rapidly. Solar power technology improved dramatically because communities needed it desperately. Battery technology advanced through necessity-driven innovation. Agricultural technology optimized for local production developed quickly. Medical technology bifurcated. Complex treatments requiring advanced equipment became unavailable in most areas, but simple diagnostic tools and preventive care technologies improved. Communities needed cheap, reliable health technology more than cutting-edge treatments. Knowledge preservation became a priority. Communities recognized that knowledge could be lost if not actively maintained. Libraries became sacred institutions. Books were treasured. People who could teach became invaluable, but knowledge also became more practical. Pre-collapse education had included much abstract knowledge that wasn't immediately useful. Post-collapse, educational focus shifted to applicable skills. Philosophy and literature became luxuries. Engineering and agriculture became essentials. This created a tension. Preserving civilization required maintaining non-practical knowledge, but survival required practical skills. Communities that focused entirely on practical skills became prosperous but culturally impoverished. Communities that preserved broader knowledge struggled economically, but maintained cultural continuity. The resolution varied by community. Some became essentially practical, losing cultural heritage in exchange for material security. Others maintained libraries and educational institutions at material cost. Most found some balance, preserving what they could while focusing primarily on survival. The sixth forced transformation: meaning and belief. Perhaps the deepest transformation was in how people found meaning and what they believed about the world. The pre-collapse era was characterized by certain dominant beliefs. Faith in progress. Belief that tomorrow would be better than today. Trust in experts and institutions. Assumption that technology would solve problems. These beliefs underpinned much of how people understood their lives. The collapse shattered these beliefs. Tomorrow wasn't better, it was worse. Experts and institutions had failed catastrophically. Technology hadn't saved anyone. The ideological foundation of the modern world cracked. Some people responded by doubling down on the old beliefs. They insisted the collapse was temporary. Recovery was coming. The old world would return. They waited for governments to fix things, for the economy to restart, for normalcy to resume. They were waiting for something that wasn't coming. Others rejected the old beliefs entirely and embraced nihilism. If the system had failed so completely, what was the point of anything? This manifested as withdrawal, substance abuse, or hedonism. The future was hopeless, so why plan or build or care? But most people eventually found their way to something else, new frameworks for understanding the world. Some turned to traditional religion, finding comfort in ancient beliefs that had survived previous collapses. Church attendance soared, not from genuine faith necessarily, but from need for community and structure. Others developed new spiritual frameworks. The collapse itself became mythologized, treated as punishment for pre-collapse excess, or as natural correction of unsustainable systems, or as opportunity for rebirth. These narratives helped people make sense of trauma. Environmentalism transformed from political movement to quasi-religion. The collapse was interpreted as nature's revenge for exploitation. Sustainability became moral imperative. Communities developed rituals around conservation and regeneration. Earth-centered spirituality filled the meaning vacuum. Stoicism experienced a revival. The ancient philosophy's emphasis on accepting what you cannot control and focusing on what you can resonated with people facing circumstances beyond their influence. Stoic texts became widely read. Stoic practices became common. The concept of progress was fundamentally reevaluated. The pre-collapse assumption that history moved in one direction, toward increasing prosperity and capability, was revealed as naive. The new understanding recognized cycles: rise and fall, advance and retreat, building and collapse. This created a different temporal orientation. The pre-collapse world was future-focused, always looking ahead to what was coming. The post-collapse world became present-focused, attending to immediate needs. The future was too uncertain to plan for extensively. Multi-generational thinking increased, paradoxically. Without faith in technological progress, people recognized that the world their grandchildren would inherit depended on what they built and preserved now. Communities started planning in decades and centuries, not quarters and years. Material values shifted dramatically. The pre-collapse obsession with accumulation, with having more, with status through consumption became absurd. You can't eat money, you can't build with stock certificates. Material value shifted to things with use value. Tools, seeds, skills, relationships. This created a values inversion. The wealthy of the old world, those with financial assets, often became poor in the new world. Their wealth was paper that became worthless. The poor of the old world, those with practical skills and community connections, often prospered in the new world. Status hierarchies reorganized around contribution. The person who could fix the water system had more status than the person who had been a senior vice president. The teacher had more respect than the former hedge fund manager. Social standing derived from what you could do, not what you had been. After the transformation settled, what had the world become? Economically smaller. Global GDP declined by an estimated 40-50% in the first 5 years after the collapse. Production was lower, efficiency was lower, standards of living dropped significantly. Materially, most people were poorer, but also more resilient. The pre-collapse economy was fragile, optimized for efficiency, vulnerable to disruption. The post-collapse economy was robust. Localized production meant regional failures didn't cascade globally. Reduced complexity meant fewer points of failure, more physically demanding. The pre-collapse world had outsourced physical labor to machines and distant workers. The post-collapse world required direct physical engagement. People were more active, stronger, also more tired and worn down by labor. More socially connected within communities, more isolated between communities. The pre-collapse world enabled weak ties across vast distances. The post-collapse world created strong ties within local groups and severed connections between them. You knew your neighbors intimately. You knew nothing of people 100 miles away. Less individually free, more collectively secure. Personal autonomy decreased as community needs took precedence. You couldn't just do what you wanted. You had responsibilities. But the trade-off was that communities took care of members. Nobody faced crisis alone, more violent in some ways, less in others. Interpersonal violence increased without effective police. Communities sometimes used force to resolve disputes or defend resources. But systemic violence decreased. No more wars requiring industrial mobilization. Conflicts were local and limited. Shorter life expectancy, but potentially higher quality of life during those years. Medical care declined. Accidents were more common. Nutrition was sometimes inadequate. People died younger. But the years they lived were often more purposeful and connected than pre-collapse existence. More uncertain, but more comprehensible. The pre-collapse world was predictable, but incomprehensibly complex. Global systems nobody understood. The post-collapse world was unpredictable, but simpler. You could understand how your community worked. You couldn't predict the harvest. Less innovative in formal technology, but more innovative in social technology. Cutting-edge, technical innovation declined, but communities experimented constantly with new governance systems, new economic arrangements, new ways of organizing. Social innovation flourished, more culturally diverse between regions, but more culturally homogeneous within regions. Without global media, regional cultures diverged. Different areas developed different practices, different beliefs, different solutions. But within each region, cultural conformity increased. Shared values became essential for cooperation. The critical question is whether these transformations are permanent or temporary. Will the world eventually return to something resembling the pre-collapse state? Or has civilization fundamentally changed? The optimistic view is that the post-collapse world is a temporary regression. Once stability is achieved, rebuilding can begin. Global trade will resume, complex supply chains will be reconstructed. Technology will advance again. The world will return to the trajectory it was on before the collapse, just delayed by a decade or two. This view assumes the collapse was an aberration, a failure of policy and coordination, not a fundamental limit. If different choices had been made, the collapse could have been avoided. Once the damage is repaired, growth can resume. The pessimistic view is that the collapse represented hitting a hard constraint. The pre-collapse world was built on cheap energy, stable climate, available resources, functional ecosystems. Those conditions no longer exist. Attempting to rebuild the old world without those conditions will just lead to another collapse. This view sees the transformation as permanent. The world has moved to a lower energy, lower complexity equilibrium. This is the new normal. Trying to return to the old normal is not just impossible, it's counterproductive. The realistic view is probably somewhere between some aspects of the pre-collapse world will return. Technology will advance again, though perhaps more slowly and in different directions. Trade will expand again, though probably not to previous levels. Complexity will increase again, though with more attention to resilience. But some aspects of the transformation are probably permanent. The extreme globalization of the pre-collapse era is unlikely to return. The level of specialization that existed before is probably unsustainable. The separation between people and the physical systems that sustain them cannot be recreated. The world was forced to become something it didn't choose. Some of those changes will be temporary adaptations to crisis. Others will be permanent features of post-collapse civilization. We're still too close to the collapse to know which is which. What can we learn from understanding these forced transformations? First, optimization creates fragility. The pre-collapse world was optimized for efficiency. Just-in-time supply chains, specialized labor, global production networks. This optimization created massive vulnerability. When disrupted, optimized systems don't degrade gracefully. They break catastrophically. Resilience requires redundancy. The post-collapse world is less efficient, but more robust. Local production is redundant, multiple communities making the same things. But when one fails, others continue. Redundancy is expensive in good times. It's priceless in bad times. Second, complexity has limits. Beyond a certain point, systems become too complex to manage. The pre-collapse financial system was so complex that nobody understood it fully. When it broke, nobody could fix it because nobody really understood how it worked. The post-collapse world is simpler, more comprehensible, more controllable. Third, communities matter more than systems. The pre-collapse world trusted abstract systems, markets, institutions, laws. When those systems failed, communities survived. Human relationships, mutual aid, shared purpose, these proved more durable than any formal system. Fourth, practical knowledge is foundation. Abstract knowledge is valuable, but in crisis, practical skills sustain life. The post-collapse world learned to value making and fixing and growing alongside thinking and analyzing and theorizing. Fifth, assumptions about permanence are dangerous. The pre-collapse world assumed its systems were permanent, that growth was infinite, that progress was inevitable. These assumptions created complacency. The world is always more fragile than it appears. Sixth, rapid transformation is possible. The speed of the post-collapse adaptations surprised everyone. When necessity demands it, people and communities can change faster than anyone believes. Human adaptability is extraordinary when activated by survival pressure. Seventh, loss is part of transformation. The post-collapse world gained resilience, community, purpose, but it lost material prosperity, individual freedom, technological advancement. Transformation is not improvement, it's change. Some aspects improve, others deteriorate. Loss is inevitable. After the 2026 collapse, the world became smaller, simpler, more local, more connected within communities, and more isolated between them. It became less wealthy materially, but potentially richer in purpose and meaning. It became more fragile in some ways and more resilient in others. This transformation was not chosen. It was forced, but it is real, and it is, at least for now, permanent. The world that exists now is not the world that existed before. It may not be the world that will exist in the future, but it is the world we have. Understanding what the world was forced to become helps us understand where we are and where we might go. The transformations reveal what matters when everything else is stripped away. Community, purpose, practical skills, resilience, connection. Meaning, these were always important. The pre-collapse world just allowed us to forget them temporarily. The collapse was a brutal reminder. And in responding to that reminder, in transforming to survive, the world revealed fundamental truths about what humans need and what societies require. The 2026 collapse broke the old world. What emerged from those fragments is still being discovered. But one thing is certain, we cannot return to what was broken. We can only move forward with what we have become. The world was forced to transform. We are living in that transformation, and we will continue to live in it, for better and worse, for the foreseeable future. This is what the world was forced to become. Not what we wanted, not what we planned, what we needed to survive. And whether we thrive in this new world or merely endure depends on whether we can accept the transformation and build something worthwhile from what remains.